I'll tell you more than just Yoshi P's shirt has green turtles on it that have shells on them, where Shell is one of the most iconic Green Mage spells in past Final Fantasy games. And yes, the Green Mage icon is shown in the final cutscene that we have before October's FanFest coming up and then the Japanese FanFest in January. We have seen this icon all over Green Mage official artwork. Boring. I want more proof. The shirt could be a billion things, including, I guess Pictomancer. I'm 100% gonna get an angry comment about that. I have to warn that some evidence that I'm using may honestly demoralize you guys to hear, because you'll be like, hey, that's pretty much already in the game. Which actually in reality only serves as a further piece of evidence that expecting something closer to home in the current design space with existing code, existing support frameworks, rather than something totally outlandish is more realistic. If you expected dimension-shifting, world-altering, totally reimagining Final Fantasy XIV's combat structure in the 2-minute window, well, disclaimer over. Green Mage will be a hammer-wielding support-based caster as a direct contrast to Black Mage, and be similar to the Bard or the Dancer in the physical range category that we have today, where Green Mage will sacrifice large chunks of its personal damage to pass out to allies in the forms of buffs, or also debuffs to enemies. Think of something like Scholar's Chain Stratagem. That's a debuff placed on an enemy. The caster role currently does not have a job that fulfills this Bard role, where it's giving out all this damage. Yes, Red Mage has a buff, yes, Summoner has a buff, but it does not come even close to the support options of Bard or Dancer. Green Mage will also provide multiple forms of party mitigation, like Red Mage's Magic Barrier in the form of Green Mage's Shell, because, well, it's literally Green Mage's Shell. Green Mage also will provide some party healing akin to Dancer's Curing Waltz or Improvisation, or Summoner's Phoenix Everlasting Flight, AoE heal for the party, or Phoenix Rekindle single target heal. It would fulfill the other half of Old Summoner fantasy that we had in Shadowbringers, where Summoner's Shadowbringers implementation vision was in constant conflict between being a big summoner like Yuna from Final Fantasy X, bringing out big beasts of Eld, and then the other half of the fantasy in conflict with that, an Affliction Warlock from World of Warcraft. Summoner's Endwalker Rework dropped the Affliction Warlock half and focused purely on the summons, making the Summoner vision a much more streamlined, much more focused realization in the game. Meaning that Green Mage would fill the void, fill that niche, and revolve around spewing tons of damage over time effects and double down way past the Summoner of Shadowbringers now that it's free of pets and have interactions focusing down on that damage over time effect of its kit. Current Summoner fulfills the big summon fantasy, and now we're missing out on that Affliction Warlock fantasy. And hopefully that perked your interest, and I'm not just spitballing, I'm gonna be maybe at risk of disappointing people with how grounded this theory gets. So what Green Mage has been in past Final Fantasy games is it primarily revolves around buffing allies and debuffing enemies. Let's not get too deep, because that's like saying Red Mage doesn't cast haste. Well, it doesn't cast haste in 14. So we're gonna tear that Green Mage old concept down to Green Mage will have party utility, as do most caster DPS, and do damage over time effects, and have some unique special status effects layered onto those damage over time effects. More on status effects in a bit. Now let's get into the evidence. First piece of evidence is that our developers actually do listen to the player base. They know people miss damage over time effect Summoner with all the interplay and all that. They have heard that loud and clear, and yes, they even stated in an interview they do not want to give Scholar back their old damage over time effects back, which, bummer for healers. I was one of those healers that was like, oh shit, when I heard that. But yes, however, that means that they heard my and the rest of our feedback wanting damage over time back and the Summoner rework. And our developers are very receptive to feedback. Very, very receptive. Similar line of thought for a second, let's talk hammers. Gaia used a hammer in Shadowbringers, and there was, to say the least, an outcry for hammers to be used. That's a huge understatement, honestly, guys. You know, people were going freaking wild for her hammer weapon type, so much so that we did see it even added into the cash shop a few years ago. Given development cycles and time, it would probably most likely align perfectly with DAWNTRAIL's job development. Green Mages use hammers and maces, and I doubt that it will be this, but imagine a hammer in one hand and a Geomancer bell in the other. That'd be bold. That'd be incredible. But given the hammer mania with Gaia, it'll likely just be a hammer or a mace with no bell. Needs more cowbell. Next point, let's talk about Krile. Love it or hate it, Krile has been a character intimately tied to the next caster job she has been seen with extreme sensitivity with Aether, and she has been seen clearly fulfilling a healing role across multiple expansions, even in so much as chastising us or just standing there as healers ourselves in Stormblood, or brought in to assess the health of the Scions and then supported them living through what happened, you know, during Shadowbringers. I'm trying to be as spoilerless as possible. So to say the least, Krile's job would be steeped deep in utility and assisting others, just because that's who she is. Now let's knock out potential party utility Green Mage would see and why it's realistic, because it's both easy to describe and interesting, because Green Mage's buff and debuff fantasy, because it's not just buffing allies, it's also casting debuffs on enemies. This absolutely exists in modern Final Fantasy XIV. Heavy hitting first note is I don't expect Green Mage to have revives. The developers already stated that they were assessing even Summoner's ability to bring revive. They said it a bit over a year ago. Summoner may not even have revive in DAWNTRAIL, so this is off the table. Remember Yoshi P's green turtles with shells on them on his shirt? Shell is an iconic Green Mage spell. However, we already have Shell exist in game. It is better known as Magic Barrier for Red Mage. Shell has always been protection against magic, and this is where a lot of the parallels to what we already have in game today come into play. Discouraging to some, I'm sure, to hear. Yes, expect homogenization to persist to some degree in DAWNTRAIL. To imagine otherwise, I don't believe is realistic, and so imagining homogenization in the next jobs I think is more realistic. I am literally gonna get beat up in the comments, but you know it's true. You know it's true. Before you leave telling me to die, you know it's true. Basically, I'm expecting Green Mage to have Shell, which is a basic 1-to-1 with Magic Barrier that doesn't have the heal amp. But I also don't think that's unreasonable to also expect that they may get a single target mitigation in the form of Protect, which would be rebranded, modernized Palisade. Range physical DPS had that during Stormblood, or Apotheosis that Black Mage had, and it's likely to be damage neutral really, so it's both Apotheosis and Palisade slammed together. No, I'm confident that the Protect of old that we know from like 2.0 is gone. It's so gone. And let's not forget, Krile's job must have healing in it to make any sense with the story, and so we could see AoE heal over time akin to something like Summoner's Phoenix Flight, or Dancer's Curing Waltz, or Dancer also has another healing button on a separate button called Improvisation, which can also become a barrier. I don't know if Green Mage will ever have a barrier. But remember, Dancer has those on two separate buttons, so Green Mage could have Shell for raw mitigation, and then like a separate one for this heal. Now, could there be like an AoE heal and a single target burst heal, like Summoner goes and gets both Phoenix Everlasting Flight for the party and Rekindle for Phoenix, applying a massive single target heal? That's a beautiful heal. I love Rekindle so much. I don't think that it's unreasonable to draw parallels between two jobs in the same role. Summoner brings a lot of utility. And then obviously Green Mage uses debuffs to provide utility, so it would get the role action addled just like every other caster. Boom. Green Mage fantasy with the existing constraints of the game. You got the buffs, you got the debuffs, with plenty of utility, which I still retain is within the bounds of reasonable given the current job design and current job utility. We are not going to escape the homogenization, guys. I just can't see it. There's an elephant in this room. Let's talk about damage over time effects, because status effects, love it or hate it, will not return to the old days of Miasma from Scholar applying a healing received reduction to the enemy and slow on to enemies. I love that stuff. Imagine for a second taking that into raid. Those debuffs mean less than nothing. And so that entire form of status effects is just flat out just gone. That's not going to happen in Final Fantasy XIV again. I cannot see it. But, and its massive Nicki Minaj-sized but, is we have a lot of existing code and systems for status effects to raise up damage. Green Mage could focus heavily here to fulfill Green Mage's debuffing fantasy. Ranged physical DPS has Dancer and Bard that provide a metric ton of buffs to their team and to facilitate their team's damage. A huge portion of their damage comes from buffing teammates, such as the Bard has persistent songs that they rotate between, Battlecry for a direct hit buff, and then Radiant Finale as a big party direct damage buff. Take Bard's Wondrous Minuet song. That increases the entire party's critical hit chance by 2%. Green Mage could have in its pile of damage to overtime effects one that increases the critical hit chance for everyone against that target by 2%, and that Green Mage tries to maintain 100% time up on that dot. Or take Scholar's Chain Stratagem, another debuff that is applied to a target. An idea similar to that could be used for a stronger 2-minute cooldown for Green Mage. So, taking this concept in a very similar way to how Bard brings 3 different buffs through its songs and through like Radiant Finale and through Battle Voice. Green Mage could bring multiple status effects that they juggle during a burst window, and if you want raw buff, why not add something like a Searing Light equivalent? In this way, the fantasy of Green Mage would be fully imagined utility-wise. You're buffing allies and debuffing, causing status effects on the enemy. That's 100% within that fantasy. That is literally in that domain. Before we further explore, we need to talk about the elephant after the room. Damage over time effects. These are real status effects in Final Fantasy XIV that we see today. Wait, damage over time effects for a job? Preposterous, right? They have largely been reworked and purged from the game, so it can't be possible that Green Mage would revolve around status effects. You're just insane, Cole. Well, no. Damage over time effects have been in the game since 1.0 days, and spoiler alert, Thaumaturge, if you take a look at it, which I'm not going to get into this video, has a huge list of spells and existed coded into the game that scream Green Mage. Old 2.0 Scholar and Summoner frankly piled on enough damage over time effects to make Affliction Warlocks from World of Warcraft blush, and even to this day in the current expansion we see damage over time effects in tons of different varieties and flavors. All healers get one damage over time effect that they are expected to keep uptime on. It's boring, but every single healer has it. Dark Knight summons Frey, which is a glorified damage over time effect, and their Salted Earth Puddle, same shit. Same with the Machinist summoning Bob to do something, Bob do something, and many more examples exist. Yet, these are all just damage over time effects with an awesome effect slapped on. Or take Bard's 2 damage over time effects, which while on the surface seem simple, when they trigger their damage, they feed into activating other skills and effects, which is really cool and I do see being expanded upon for a job like Green Mage that would be really in these damage over time effects. That is a very big domain for a game designer to play in. And if you don't believe me, check out Shadow Priest, check out Affliction Warlock. There is so much potential there. I don't want to say Boomkin, but even they have some interplay. Now, did Paladin have their damage over time effects rolled up into their blade skill in patch 6.3? Yes, and developers stated that it was to add consistency to Paladin's burst phase, which opening that with the previous statement of other damage over time effects in the current game is a large can of worms to open. So, why does Dark Knight still summon Living Shadow? Point being, unless we saw significant changes to almost all jobs, damage over time effects are still to this day extremely in the game and gonna come in DAWNTRAIL. Gunbreaker has some, Paladin still has some even. Blue Mage is frankly riddled with them. I'll talk about why burst consistency with the new Green Mage would be less of a concern. Spoiler, it's basically faster in that initial ramp. So if you're worried about why Green Mage would have like any issue with consistent outgoing burst windows, there are many jobs in the current version of the game that you should be more worried about. But let's take a look at my baby. Summoner was my baby at 200 subs, and I made the outrageous 1 hour, 20-minute long Summoner guide that put me on the map, and oh my god. People are going to be like, did you make it for money? You don't get a single penny from YouTube below 1,000 subs. I did that out of pure love. I loved it. I never expected to pass 200, 300 subs. It's only, how to say it? I'm not the only one, though, that loves Summoner is the point I'm trying to say. The developers know this, and the developers have been undeniably hearing us cry aloud this expansion. We have been very loud to this expansion. So it makes sense for the new caster job to double down on the Affliction Warlock fantasy. Basically, Summoner was a giant load of baggage, combining the current Summoner, which is the pure Summoner fantasy with the big beasts, and then Affliction Warlock. The design of Old Summoner was kept bound between two separate worlds, two separate visions. With Summoner dropping the Affliction Warlock side, there has been left a void. A void a Green Mage would be very, very, very capable of filling. Dare I say that I would probably quit healing for this DPS? Would I become a DPS main? Oh shit. I'll never quit healing, but I seriously do see myself maining this if it exists. Let's talk about the ability Fester, because this is very important for Green Mage. Obviously, it's going to be repackaged, it's going to have a different name, new effect, but I see it coming back for Green Mage under a different name. Summoner has an ability named Fester, which exists today, but it used to deal more damage based on how many damage over time effects were on the target. And if you come from World of Warcraft, definitely do think of Affliction Warlock's Malefic Raptor ability, and as someone who played Affliction Warlock during my short stay there, this was one of the most fun abilities to work with and was widely regarded as a positive change by the community. But Fester with DAWNTRAIL, I expect Fester to be completely removed from the Summoner because it's frankly a no interaction off GCD, which when they tighten the Summoner fantasy, I don't see it staying. It just seems random at this point, like literally a relic from the old conflicted Affliction Warlock Summoner design of the Summoner. But now let's talk about why Fester's so important, because it's a clear indication that if Paladin's 6.83 change for consistent burst was a concern, that the damage over time base class would be able to utilize something like Fester to have that big burst during those windows, which is always weird to say because damage over time effects generally do snapshot the current buffs that you do have at the time. In fact, I'd place good money that Green Mage would acquire Fester charges in combat, maybe like Sage gets Adderskull charges or how Dancer gets Feathers actually. Dancer Feathers may be a better analogy because I really could see it going down that way, and then Green Mage would just pop them during burst windows. But we'll talk about implementation in a different video because we have, I could probably talk 3 hours easily for that. I've done it in Discord already. I really could. Point is, Green Mage I'm fully convinced is what we're getting. It simply fills a niche in this game that is currently missing, and it can fulfill what we are wanting from a Green Mage while still adhering to all the constraints given in current game design of 14 space without warping or breaking the game. There is nothing here as I went over all those skills, all those utilities. None of that I listed warps the game or bends the rules. So I'm going to defer to what I said at the start of the video. Green Mage with all of its status effects and buffs and debuffs very much can exist as a support caster. It strikes all the right chords, which is what the community has asked for. Krile herself as a character, the numerous hints towards the job, and simply makes sense in the current design space of 14 and what we're missing. Which leads into what other builder spender system is needed. Well, you know what, we can talk about that in a different video, but point is, I definitely see this coming, and I'm sharing this video with you guys because I genuinely am kind of excited because Green Mage sounds freaking badass.